You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Today is our first ever Protestant Libertarian Podcast roundtable, and it is going to be a really good one. My guests today are Reverend Doctor Jennifer Copeland, who is the director of the North Carolina Council of Churches, who wrote the recent piece, Dishonoring the Boy Scouts of America, which we will be discussing on the show today. Dr. Christina Cowger, who is the facilitator of North Carolina Stop Torture Now, an organization that has been fighting against CIA torture programs that use North Carolina-based planes, and Raymond McGovern, an Army veteran and a CIA analyst for decades, who has a heroic record of opposing the excesses of the U.S. war on terror and has written in a ton of different forums. Welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, everybody.
Glad to be here.
So before we get started, I want to give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves to my audience. I think, Jennifer, I'm going to start with you since you were the one that wrote the piece we're going to be discussing today. Just give us kind of a short background on who you are.
Sure. I'm a United Methodist pastor ordained in the South Carolina Conference, but I have been the executive director of the North Carolina Council of Churches for about 8 years now. The Council of Churches, for those who don't know, has a long track record of standing on the side of justice, taking its cues from the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament Gospels to speak out to power, speak out to anyone, quite frankly, when we believe that the rights of individuals, particularly the poor and the vulnerable, are being trampled upon.
All right. Perfect. Thank you very much. And Christina, how about you?
So I am, as you said, the coordinator of North Carolina Stop Torture Now, a grassroots network in North Carolina that was started in 2005 when we first learned that the CIA was using North Carolina as a base of operations, essentially, to conduct rendition missions. And we learned that from the New York Times, in fact, in that year. And so we have been working ever since, as you said, to try to expose this practice and to get the state of North Carolina to stop its involvement and to hold itself accountable. And so that is has been my role for these past 17 years now.
All right, great. Ray, how about you?
I could say first that I specialized in Russian studies when I was in college and graduate school, went into the Army, and served as a CIA analyst for almost 3 decades, measuring, watching, and analyzing Soviet foreign policy, Russian foreign policy. And when I saw my former colleagues at the CIA manufacturing evidence to start a war against Iraq, I started to speak out, formed a little group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We've been publishing and trying to put the word out all along. Lastly, when I publish or when I speak or when I be interviewed, I identify myself with the Ecumenical Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. I run a small nonprofit underneath their umbrella called Tell the Word. Tell the Word. Well, you can imagine what the mission is there. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, again, thank you all so much for coming on today. Jennifer, I want to start with you. You wrote this excellent piece called Dishonoring the Boy Scouts of America, which is about a visit that former President George W. Bush made to North Carolina. What was the whole point of that trip?
The piece was about President Bush's visit to a Boy Scout event in Raleigh, North Carolina, which was essentially a fundraising event. And my problem with his presence among the Boy Scouts is their behavior is antithetical. The Boy Scouts are supposed to stand for integrity and honor, and I do not believe that the actions of George Bush while he was president have very much to do with integrity or honor, particularly as it relates to the war on terror and the war with Iraq and with the torture of individuals from other countries. So we were...
Yeah, and you give a couple...
Sorry?
Oh, I was going to say, you give a couple of really good examples of that in your piece. Could you just share with us one or two examples of the ways that that the Bush administration was kind of complicit in a policy of torture?
Yeah, I can. But Ray is actually the expert on that particular question. He knows it up close and personal. So the examples that I gave are examples that are for public review in the document from the Commission on the Inquiry for the Commission on Torture. All of this stuff is already on record, but Ray knows a great deal about it.
Yeah, and I want to come to Ray and have him talk about that here in just a second. But real quick, Christina, I want to bring you in here. North Carolina was kind of an ironic state for Bush to visit because, as you and your organization have claimed over the last several years, North Carolina has been used for his rendition program, or at least planes that were based out of North Carolina. Could you explain what the word rendition means to my audience, and then explain how North Carolina got involved in those torture programs?
Sure, yeah. And so the CIA set up the Rendition, Detention, and Interrogation, or RDI program, shortly after 9/11, and they began rendering people, yeah. So the word rendition means, it's a polite way of saying kidnapping, basically. So the individual is grabbed off the street somewhere in West Africa or Europe or Egypt, wherever, and blindfolded, beaten, drugged with an anal suppository, stripped naked, photographed, and then dressed in a jumpsuit, shackled, and goggled, and headphones on, so for sensory deprivation, and then without a word of explanation, flown to a location, either a CIA secret prison somewhere in Eastern Europe or Afghanistan, perhaps, or to a third country like Morocco, where he, and it was almost always a man, could be held indefinitely and secretly without any access to family or a lawyer or the Red Cross, and tortured at the will of the CIA or this allied security force, perhaps in Morocco, at the behest of the CIA. And so this was done to literally hundreds of people in the CIA's Rendition, Detention, and Interrogation program. North Carolina planes and pilots flew at least half the missions that we know about, the rendition missions, based in Smithfield or in Kinston, North Carolina. That's Aero contractors. And so Aero was instrumental in this program. It literally could not have gotten off the ground without Aero contractors based here in North Carolina.
And had they worked for the CIA before, or was this a brand new kind of business opportunity for them in light of the war on terror?
They were started by the CIA, so they are essentially a CIA proprietary. You might call them a front company for the CIA. They have only one client, and that is the CIA. And so they were started in like 1979, 1980 to do business for the CIA that the CIA didn't want known publicly. So they look like civilian aircraft when they fly around the globe, and then they can do dirty work for the CIA without people immediately knowing what's going on.
Okay. All right. Well, Ray, you were in the CIA for a long time. You have a real insider's perspective on how the CIA works. Has the CIA always operated this way, or is this a response to the war on terror?
Well, I have to respond to Jennifer's suggestion that I know all this up close and personal. I do, to the extent that I threw back to the head of the House Intelligence Committee this great big medallion they gave me at retirement, the Intelligence Commendation Medal for exemplary service. I told them I didn't want to be associated, however remotely, with an agency overtly involved in torture. I was a CIA analyst. Long story short, there were analysts and operators. We had nothing to do with the operators. But, as an Army officer, as an Army infantry intelligence officer, I knew certain things, like torture doesn't work. I mean, it's self-defeating. It gives you lousy information. It just is not effective. And then as a Christian, I learned that it's immoral, for God's sake. And there are laws against it, right? So people say, well, it's illegal. I said, well, yeah, it's it's illegal because it's immoral. It's not, it's not bad because it's illegal. I mean, it fits the category of what I learned in philosophy and theology of intrinsic evil. All is wrong, like rape, like slavery. All is wrong. So when I saw that this was going on, my colleagues and I spoke out against it. We came down to visit Christina at one point and tried to demonstrate before the senator who actually put me in prison later on for a little while. Senator, what was it? Richard Burr. Yeah, it's like a real burr into my saddle. Anyhow, he's going to be gone. Okay, so it's at one point I'll just add this that I was speaking to an audience out in Berkeley, and I was staying with a very, very high-heeled, very wealthy person, and I made the point that not only is A, B, C, and D about torture immoral, illegal, doesn't work, but the fellow that I try to model my life against is a fellow called Jesus of Nazareth, and what happened to him, right? He was tortured. So what's the point of this? My agnostic friend, where I was staying that night, says, Ray, it's really interesting to hear all that. And we know about that. But I'm agnostic. I'm an atheist. And, I know torture is wrong. I mean, I know that people just don't do that to other people. I mean, so thanks a lot for your biblical allusions here. But people should realize, because they're human, that humans don't treat other humans that way. And so he made the point very effectively. And from then on, I kind of had to widen my perspective and said, well, torture is just wrong. And the people who are responsible for it, like George Bush, I mean, we have his signature on the memo, February 5th, 2001, where he sent it to all his chief national security. I had a chance to ask a couple of those people, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What'd you do when you got that memo? He said, well, that defies the code of military justice, as far as I'm concerned. He should have quit on the spot, or he should have just come to the press and stopped it right then and there. But no, he was picked because he was malleable, just like these other folks still picked because they were malleable.
So you think that they knew that George Bush was going to go along with whatever program they wanted him to run for them? Is that kind of the point that you're getting at there?
Well, it's worse than that. Dick Cheney, Bush's vice president, orchestrated the whole thing with these faux lawyers whipping up memos saying, well, the Geneva Conventions really don't have to apply except when military, except when military considerations dictate otherwise. It was just one of these lawyerly things. But the memo is out there. It's been published. It shows that it prescinds from the Geneva Conventions and says, we will treat people humanely as appropriate and as consistent with military necessity. That's not what Geneva says.
Yeah, so let's talk about that real quick then, Ray, because again, Jennifer did a great job of outlining some of kind of the highlights of Bush's terror campaigns during his administration. Could you explain what some of those torture practices were that the CIA under the Bush administration implemented?
Well, first, let me say that they were demonstrated in the basement of the White House to people like John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, people like the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, Defense, Rumsfeld. They were demonstrated. What kind of torture technique you think would be best for this kind of rendered person, okay? It was that heinous, okay? And it involved waterboarding, always recognized as a heinous offense, banging people's head into walls, sleep deprivation, which is a very serious thing, can cause permanent psychological damage, and Other things like keeping you in a little box forever, and a couple of people were killed. Now, was anyone held accountable? No, and that's the rub. When you let the authorizer of all this slither into the city in which you live, if you're a prophetic person, you have to speak out. That's precisely what Jennifer has done, and we just welcome the chance to say not everybody in Raleigh is going to laugh when George W. Bush tells jokes about invading Iraq or countenancing torture.
Yeah, so I kind of want to open this up to any of you guys that want to respond to this, but like I couldn't imagine watching somebody demonstrate one of those torture techniques in front of me and think that that was somehow okay. What is it about the politicians that allow them to, I guess, justify this more? Like how do you think they sleep at night?
I'll take that one. It's not just the politicians. It's any of us who need to create an enemy, and all you have to do is other that person. You, in your own mind, reduce that person to less than a person, and then you can do anything you want to. It happens all the time. And I'm sure that what was preeminent in the minds of those folks who were watching those demonstrations is these people have hurt us, or these people or people like them have harmed us, and therefore they deserve this. Well, that's as far from how human beings should behave toward each other as I can think of getting. That it's just not, as Ray said earlier, what humans should do. It's all well and good to seek the truth, but you don't seek the truth by creating more harm than the harm which has already been perpetrated. So again, back to my main point, all we have to do is convince ourselves that this person with whom we are disagreeing or over whom we want to have power and control is really not as good as we are, so less than a person.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that Jennifer is making. And, it's worth noting explicitly that every single victim of the CIA's rendition, detention, and interrogation program was and is a Muslim person. So without exception, this was perpetrated entirely on Muslim prisoners, whether they were from Libya, whether they were from Europe, whether they were from the United Kingdom. These were people who were snatched up, often without any hint of connection to the 9/11 plot or any of the previous terror plots that had been visited, like the USS Cole bombing. So these were people who were caught up in a dragnet, essentially. And the mission was round up as many people as you can from Muslim countries, stick them either directly into Guantanamo, or if you have reason to think that you can torture confessions out of them and that you might be able to portray them as a so-called high-value detainee, then take them directly to a CIA prison, a secret prison in Poland or Romania or Afghanistan, where you can keep them indefinitely and just torture them until they'll confess to anything.
So do you think that this is why they applied the label terrorist to absolutely everyone who was over in the Middle East during the war on terror? Because again, and to put this in perspective, so I was in seventh grade when 9/11 happened. So I'm as ignorant as can be. And I, believe basically everything that George Bush told me, because that was what we were taught in school, that we had to believe what our presidents told us to believe. And so when he said that the Taliban were terrorists and Al-Qaeda was terrorist, I was like, oh, well, all these people are terrorists. And so I guess we have a right to be fighting them. Is that why they use that kind of language to make it appear as if everyone's involved in these activities? Is that what's going on there?
I'm happy to start with that one as well. And I'll say this, Alex, words make a world. So the words that we use intentionally create a narrative that we want people to believe. So you use the word terrorist, and that conjures up in our minds all kinds of negative images. And just to piggyback a little bit on what Christina said, in addition to all of these people being Muslim, they were all brown people, black and brown people. They weren't white Muslims from Great Britain. They were all black and brown people. So now you're going to couple an image of a dark-skinned person with the word terror. And it doesn't take very long for the American imagination to kick in. We have a whole layered 500-year history of creating terror on the backs of Black people.
And what do you think? So they're over in the Middle East, and they're picking these people up regardless of whether or not they're associated with any sort of terror organization. What was the CIA hoping to get out of these people? Because again, as you mentioned in your article, Jennifer, a lot of these people that were picked up weren't even terrorists. They committed no crime. They were just randomly kidnapped, rendered by the government. What were they trying to get out of them?
Let's not use terrorists on this podcast. Let's call them potential war criminals.
All right. Oh, yeah, perfect.
Ray knows the answer to this question.
Well, one objective, of course, was to justify a war of aggression, a war that had several other meanings behind it. Oil. We thought it would be good for Israel if we deposed Saddam Hussein. And we coveted a military base in Iraq. I call that logistics. So OIL, oil, Israel, and logistics. We wanted to document the narrative that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And we also were hopeful to get somebody to tell us that Saddam Hussein was linked to Al-Qaeda, and therefore, by inference, Saddam Hussein was in some measure responsible for what happened on 9/11. This campaign succeeded beautifully. And part of it was getting a so-called terrorist, giving him to the Egyptians, telling the Egyptians, we think this guy knows that there are ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. See if we can get that from him. And guess what the Egyptians came up with? Now that actually happened. And that was woven into Colin Powell's speech at the UN on the 5th of February, 2003. That's how bad it gets. There were no ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And as we know now, there were no weapons of mass destruction. There were people in Washington who knew that. We knew that. But no one in the press would let us into the press to say those things. And it's very similar now with respect to Ukraine. If you say that the Russians have national interests, if you say that the Russians feel an existential threat from the U.S. and NATO, just as the U.S. felt an existential threat from Russia in Cuba in 1962, if you say those things, you're almost a terrorist. At least you're in Putin's pocket. It happens to be true. The problem is that the media is so subservient to the government, I have to say, that the only narrative that's allowed is the one that you're hearing day in and day out.
So this was all basically built on a lie, and the politicians knew that. I mean, they obviously had objectives other than trying to win a war on terror. They wanted to be over there for other reasons. What do you think? I mean, you mentioned oil and logistics and things like that. Was there ever an end game in the Bush administration? Like, did they ever see that all of the torture and all of the fighting and all of that was going to come to some sort of conclusion that would make the world a better place, or what were they thinking when they were doing this?
I mean, I think one thing to point out is that with regard to the torture program, they weren't thinking beyond, very, very much beyond, we're going to torture some confessions out of people, quote unquote, and then we'll use those to, as Ray said, to justify things like the invasion of Iraq, which, as he says, actually happened. They also definitely wanted to capture people whom they could connect to the 9/11 plot directly, which they did, and tortured them brutally for over years in different locations in Eastern Europe and in Cuba before sending them to Guantanamo Bay. And so we just have to bring Guantanamo into the picture here as part of this whole scenario. Because that was part of their plan as well when they had tortured people in secret locations whom they regarded as potentially having the ability to confess to big things. Then they would stick them in Guantanamo and basically throw away the key. So Guantanamo is an example of a blatant human rights violation where we're offshoring the detention of people, many of them in perpetuity until they die, and many of them without ever bringing criminal charges against them, giving them an opportunity to defend themselves and perhaps secure their release. So these are permanent detainees without trial. Another practice that we ostensibly hold dear is habeas corpus, the right to a trial, the right to face your accusations in a court. And we're completely violating that there, again, because these people are Muslims, they're not Americans, and so consequently we don't have to afford them this right.
Yeah. And so do you think, to that point too, I know I have a lot of kind of going all over the place with this right here, but this is all really interesting stuff. So if these had been like Eastern European nationalists that would have flown the plane into the World Trade Centers, do you think that we would have responded the same way? Or is it just it happened to be people that were different than us and they took complete advantage of that cultural divide?
That's a good question. I think the answer may be that it's a lot easier for the other to be demonized. They don't look like us. They're swarthy and they're people of color. And, we're Americans. So it's an extension of the racism that lies at the bottom of our policies ever since, 4 centuries ago. But it applies internationally now. So if we perceive ourselves as the sole indispensable country in the world, the exceptional country, the city on the hill, if you will, then everybody else is, dispensable, unexceptional. And they can be tortured and murdered and whatever, because we have sort of a divine right to do those things. One of my major pains is a lack of the institutional church to stand up to what was clearly a blatant violation of human rights. Little vignette. After World War II, there was a Dominican monastery in France. And one of the prophets of that time went and said, now listen, why didn't the church speak up during World War II? And they go, there was an encyclical. I said, what's an encyclical? And they explained. He said, well, I didn't hear it. We were waiting for the voice. Here I'm an agnostic, he said. We were waiting for the voice of Rome, and it never was heard. So encyclicals are spectacles. I don't know what that means. So what we need here, in my view, is people that have the courage of their convictions. And I'm so happy to be in North Carolina now, where the North Carolina Council of Churches is doing the gutsy thing, speaking out, in large part in the lack of other moral institutions that should be speaking out, but are afraid to, frankly.
So you kind of hinted at the way that the media has deliberately underplayed these torture programs over the last 20 years. And I want to put this to you, all of you guys, but with Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, we have had all this information in the public sphere for a long time. And for me, I didn't really start thinking seriously about these issues until I read Scott Horton's book, Enough Already, last year. That was kind of my first real introduction into just how bad all of this was. I just kind of believed the narrative for a really long time. So the information's out there, but they do such a good job of making it seem like those people are conspiracy theorists. Is that, I kind of want to talk about that. Do you think that that's the reason why it's hard for so many people to stand up? Is it just the way it's portrayed in the media? People don't never have access to the information. It's buried under other stories. What are the factors that make it difficult for the average person like me to get high quality information about what's been happening for the last 20 years?
I would raise one factor that accounts for people in North Carolina not knowing about our state's prominent role in rendition and torture. And that is that apart from a very few examples back in about 2007, the newspapers of record, the News and Observer and the Charlotte Observer, have been very wary of covering this story. And public radio, I would say the same about our national public radio affiliate here in North Carolina. They've been very shy to cover this. And I think that one of the main reasons is that our governors and attorneys general, and of course there's one person who fits both categories, which is our current governor, Roy Cooper, who was attorney general back when grassroots activists were exposing North Carolina's involvement in rendition and torture. So Roy Cooper and his predecessor in office, Mike Easley, and also Roy Cooper then as governor, have never said one public word about aero contractors, about us having helped to conduct fully half the rendition missions which have brought people to their torture chambers, and about how torture is wrong and our state shouldn't be involved in it. Citizens have been asking for this literally since 2006. A delegation from the North Carolina Council of Churches met with Governor Easley's chief of staff back in early 2006 and pleaded with him to take the New York Times seriously and look into the use of our Smithfield and our Kinston airports, Kinston being a state-run airport, the Global Transport, a state-run economic development project. So back at that time, people of faith, people of conscience started pleading with the governor and the attorney general, and that's been happening ever since, and they have categorically refused to say anything public about it, let alone to conduct the investigation that we've been asking for.
And you would think, since they're using public funds specifically from North Carolina taxpayers, right? Like, these aren't federal funds they're being used from people of your state, and they're not.
Yeah. Oh, good example of that at the Johnston County Airport in Smithfield. That's a county airport, but it receives state Department of Transportation funds to render it safe and secure. And those funds were used in one instance about 8 years ago to specifically reinforce that corner of the airport where Aero Contractors is domiciled, has hangars and offices and parking lots. And so they put up big, tall barbed wire fences pointing outwards and security cameras around the gate, but only at that corner of the airport where Aero Contractors is. The rest of the airport has cow pasture fences that you could hop over in a heartbeat. Any of us could, even I, as old as I am. So it was instructive, state funds being used specifically for the purpose, instead of investigating Aero Contractors, shielding them from any possible protester who might want to go there and trespass nonviolently to commit civil disobedience, which has also happened there, but not since they reinforced that corner of the airport.
Man, it's like these people could not be more obvious that they're doing something nefarious. It just doesn't, it's so blatantly obvious. Jennifer, I want to ask you about this from a ministerial perspective. I worked in a Methodist church for 3 years. I was in youth ministry for a really long time. I worked in the Lutheran church first and then spent a few years working for a Methodist church. And granted, I'm in Kentucky, so obviously the political climate's a little bit different here. But I never heard anyone in ministry talk about any of these issues ever. We would have our, September 11th church service or the Veterans Day church service, and they would mention, praying for the people that were fighting in the wars, but nobody ever stood up and said, hey, this might be wrong. Why do you think that there are so many Christians that have kind of an aversion to talking about these issues?
Well, I think part of the answer goes back to what you and Christina were talking about earlier. You have to pay attention. First of all, you have to know what's going on. So you're saying that the behavior of the folks who perpetrated these torture crimes is obvious, but it's only obvious because you're having this conversation with the three of us right now, and we've been working on it for a long, long time. I highly recommend to the people who are listening to this podcast the report that was put together by the North Carolina Commission on Torture. It's called the Commission's, Christina, help me out, the Inquiry on Torture, Commission for the Inquiry on Torture.
Well, the report is called Torture Flights. So if you Google Torture Flights, and it was published by the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture, a grassroots blue ribbon panel.
Thank you. Yeah. lots of words to string together in the correct place. But that's the answer to your question. Why don't more Christian people care about what happened here in North Carolina? They don't know about it. So first, we have to educate people about what's been going on. And once you educate them, then you can inspire them through the lens of whatever their moral spectrum is. For us at the North Carolina Council of Churches, it's the lens of Christianity. So first, I want to educate you about what happened. And then I want to inspire you to take this material that you now know and refract it through the lens of faith. And when you refract what happened to these folks through the lens of faith, or through your moral compass, or through whatever system it is that you use to determine right from wrong, you ought to be activated and motivated to do something. If not, then, just to quote a little scripture, you're a lukewarm Christian, and we know what the Bible says about lukewarm.
Yeah, and it always has been really interesting to me, because even before I started thinking about these issues seriously, when I was in ministry, I never felt like it was appropriate for me to celebrate the death of a human being, even though I did believe the narrative that was being sold to me by the government that all these people were terrorists and wanted to kill me. It just never felt right to celebrate that kind of stuff in public for me. But it just seems like so many people don't make that connection. Ray, I kind of want to ask you about the government side of this. I had a couple of weeks back on my show Lori Calhoun from the Libertarian Institute, and she had a piece called The Military Industrial Cult, and she was talking about how the military industrial complex kind of operates like a cult does. Like, no matter how wrong they get it, no matter how messed up it is, they continue to get money and they continue to receive funding. And one of the points she made is that, like, the Department of Defense, they employ something like 30,000 public relations employees. So does the CIA are they involved in operations like that are designed to make us as a society comfortable with programs like torture?
Okay. Yeah, not to be crass about this, but if you read the New York Times over the weekend, you will see pieces written with the assistance of intelligence officers, intelligence journalists, and so forth. The CIA all but writes these articles. And it's an open secret that the mass media is conforming to what the government wants the narrative to be. And I think Jennifer and Christina were quite right that it's up to us, up to you, and anybody else who can speak out or have some sort of platform to tell the truth about all this, because only if people appreciate that they've been conned, that they've been misled, that the torture did happen, and it was authorized by this president who now is speaking to the Boy Scouts about what? Honor? Okay. Unless we educate. One good thing I have to say about the Bush visit here was that he slithered in and he slithered out, and nobody ever heard a word about it. So I think they got the idea that the welcoming committee, of which two of us were part, was alive and well. I'd like to point out that Dr. King had it right. When I was teaching, I would always use the letter from the Birmingham City Jail, and I picked out one quote that I liked above all the others, and it pertains to what we're talking about. This, Dr. King was talking about justice and injustice and lies, and he says, like a boil that can never be cured as long as it's covered up, but must be broken with all its pus-flowing ugliness and open to the natural lights of light and air. So too injustice and lies must be exposed with all the friction that this exposure creates to the light of human conscience and to the air of national opinion before it can be cured. Okay? I still hope that this can be cured. It's an uphill battle. We're keeping at it, all of us. It's just that the odds are really remarkably high, higher than ever in my short life. And, it just impels me to keep going. And I think that the king tells us it's ugly. People are going to resist it. There's going to be lots of friction. But, Jesus of Nazareth didn't die in his bed. And there was a reason for why they killed him. It had to do with justice.
That's beautiful. I want to talk real quick about the politics of this too. So one of the points that you made in your piece, Jennifer, and one of the things that I've really come to appreciate over the last year or so as I've been doing my research on this is that, every single administration in the 21st century has been complicit in these programs. And for me, it's really hard to understand, in 2008, you have the election of Barack Obama, and he's running against, a very unpopular Republican candidate. George Bush had very low approval ratings at the end, and people were starting to turn against the war on terror. And I think even in his campaign, he kind of ran against the war. And so it seems like it would have been a slam dunk for him to become president and say, we're going to shut this entire program down. I have all of these big domestic spending policies that I want to pursue. I don't want to invest any more I don't want to invest any more money in the war on terror. Why did the Obama administration and then the Trump administration after that keep this stuff going?
I think that's a great question because my memory is that President Obama said he was going to shut Guantanamo Bay. He was going to figure out what was going on with all those people and put an end to it and resolve it all. And then that did not happen, or it turned into something that was far more complicated than perhaps he naively believed before he became president. Why didn't he release the report? Why didn't he tell the truth about what was contained in that report that came out of the Senate? I do not know the answer to that question. Because I actually agree with Ray that when something like this happens, something this heinous happens, the sooner you get it out there and you tell the truth about it, the quicker we are able to move on and become better. So why are we now setting up museums to commemorate those who were lynched in this country sometimes as much as 100 years ago? What would have happened if somebody had spoken out in the early 1900s about lynching and said, we really need to put a stop to this. This is immoral. This is wrong. But we didn't speak out. And now 100 and some years later, we have museums about it. Again, I think it's just very hard for people to tell the truth in the moment because it's hard. But when the people who perpetrated these crimes are dead and gone, then historians can dig all this stuff up and we can all go, oh my gosh, why didn't those people in 2001 put a stop to this?
The old now it can be told syndrome, when it's very, very late, then we can tell the truth. I agree, and I would say about the Barack Obama administration that its failure to hold the Bush administration accountable for the crimes of secret imprisonment, torture, rendition, kidnapping, and in fact, its willingness to side with the CIA, what was a travesty almost on a par with Bush authorizing those crimes to begin with. Because if the other party can't hold the crimes of the other party to account, then we have no way to do that. The CIA has effectively no functioning oversight in this country. And Ray can talk a lot more about that. But basically, the Senate Intelligence Committee, which has been chaired by our own Senator Richard Burr, whom we mentioned, is supposed to hold the CIA to account. And it has been really very unwilling to do that in any effective way, other than publishing its report about those who were held in CIA secret prisons. But on the basis of that report, President Obama, as Jennifer mentioned, fought tooth and nail against the release of that report. His White House defended the CIA. And I think it was because, effectively, the CIA had Obama under their thumb.
Yeah. Wow. That's quite a charge, Christina, and I believe you're right. And I can speak with some authority. It was an incredible disappointment how Obama pledged first day in office. I remember he's going to close Guantanamo, right? But then he didn't. And then they destroyed the torture tapes, and he did nothing. And then they started this investigation. That was the good news. Then they had these guys dead to their rights, these guys who had put pistols up to the heads of people. And, they knew who they were. So they appointed a special counsel. His name was John Durham, and he let him off. He said, "Now we're done." Okay, so what's the deal here? Let's assume Obama has the right instincts. Let's assume he really believed that torture wasn't that torture was wrong, and that these people should be freed and Guantanamo should be closed. What happened? Well, in June of 2008, he was joined by a fellow by name of John Brennan, who had been head of lots of the CIA stuff, and Obama had just said, "Hey, I just learned that these multinational corporations that are running our telecommunications are scooping up all our telephone calls. So this is terrible. I think this is awful," says Senator Obama. John Brennan joins his little staff, and he says, Obama in early July 2008 says, "Well, I don't think it's so bad. We need to find these terrorists, okay?" And then he wants to appoint Brennan to be head of the CIA, and that was just a little too much because of his defense of rendition and so forth. But Obama was quoted one time at a small dinner of fundraisers, okay? Progressive people, and apparently there were only about 20 of them, and they said, "Mr. President, why don't you deliver on this promise? Why don't you live?" And finally, he got exercised, and over dessert, he threw down his fork and he stood up and he said, "All right, don't you guys remember what happened to Dr. King?" And he walked off. Now, I have that story secondhand. I wasn't there, okay? But I can believe that these people live in fear, including the Richard Burrs, who don't do oversight, but overlook. They have overlook committees. That's what they are. They're afraid because they know the FBI or CIA has lots of stuff on them. Everybody's got skeletons in their closet. And I hate to admit it, but I agree with Christina. I don't think Obama had the guts to do what we all wanted him to do, and that the CIA is pretty much what we call the deep state, running things in this country, including the war in Ukraine.
And do you think that explains why even like Donald Trump wouldn't put an end to all of this stuff? Because I mean, even in his, and he's very flawed in a lot of ways, but I know that, he used the term military industrial complex early on in his presidency. And it seems like for him, it would have been a political slam dunk to say, look, the Democrats couldn't end the war. The traditional wing of the Republican Party that hates me couldn't end the wars. I ended the wars. I'm the best person in the world. Everyone loves me. That seems like that's something that he would have done. But, as you guys are saying, if the CIA really does have a much power and influence, and then you have someone like Trump, who obviously has a very corrupt history, there are a lot of skeletons in that closet. He might not want some of those coming out. Is that kind of what we're getting at here?
You got that right.
Yeah, and I think also, Alex, that it suited Trump's tough guy persona to talk glowingly about torture, which is basically all that he ever did regarding the U.S. torture history. The recent history is basically say how wonderful it was and how he would waterboard more people.
Well, and I mean, for him too, like it's what's inexcusable is that Congress gave him the opportunity to end the war in Yemen and he vetoed it. I mean, like that's it's horrible. Like again, bipartisan support. It's a slam dunk politically. And so you guys are absolutely right. Like there has to be something bigger than just political or personal calculation for these people. So I guess that brings me, we got about 10 minutes left here. And that brings me to a couple of questions that I kind of want to ask you guys just as we wrap this up. So one of the things that I think is really important as we think about this is that, like, it is true that Bush and Obama and Trump, they're all war criminals, right? And as you mentioned in your piece, Jennifer, like when President Bush went over to Europe, like there was the potential that he could have been arrested for war crimes over there, and so he kind of has to stay stateside. What in a world where justice was actually served, what would happen to these people?
In a world where justice is served through the lens of my faith, people confess what they've done wrong. And that's what happens. They tell the truth about what's been done. And then you figure out, okay, where do we go from here? And it may not be the kind of retribution and punishment that most of us have come to expect. There's a lot of grace in truth-telling. There's a lot of healing that can happen when people just confess their truth, confess the sin. I mean, that's the language we use in the church. You confess your sin, but sin is kind of a catch-all phrase for the things I've done wrong or the things I have failed to do, could have done, and this would be more President Obama. This is what I could have done to make this right, but I failed to do anything. Therefore, it's still wrong.
I think that's a really good point. First comes the acknowledgement. There is also the fact that the United States owes a lot to people whom it has tortured illegally and immorally. And so redress should be on the table after the acknowledgement. There are citizen efforts to provide redress. For example, there's a Guantanamo Survivors Fund that has been set up and is operating out of the No More Guantanamo's website. And the Guantanamo Survivors Fund takes applications from people who have managed to be transferred out of Guantanamo but are still hounded by the U.S. sort of blacklisting them in the countries to which they were transferred. And so citizens can make donations to help people pay the rent, buy food. Many of these people have just been dumped in a third country without really the means to survive adequately. So, point being, that doesn't really substitute for the kind of redress that the U.S. government owes to people. But that should be, I think, part of our mindset as we think about our government with our tax money having committed these crimes against these people. Yeah. We owe them.
And Ray, I'm assuming you're going to agree with the points that both of them made.
You assume correctly. Yeah, these are wonderful people from whom I've learned a lot.
Beautiful. Well, I got just a couple more questions for you guys. The first is, so if we were able to go back in a time machine, 2001, 9/11 happens, and we have the ability to, kind of take George Bush out of the pocket of the CIA, what would have been the proper response to 9/11? Like, how could we have handled that without having to kill 2 million people and torture thousands and thousands of innocent people?
There were memoranda written well before 9/11 by the intelligence community and also by the Defense Department, which said that there's violent extremism happening in the Middle East. And it is largely because of Israeli treatment of Palestinians and the U.S. 100% support for them. Now, the Department of Defense actually authorized and blessed a report that said precisely that. Namely, if you want to prevent this extremist terrorism, and especially with respect to people like Muslims and other Palestinians, then you have to address these grievances. You have to figure out a better way to relate to Israel. That was not really published anywhere. It came out and people went, I don't want to talk about that, see? So it's a real problem. The media is the fly in the ointment here. It prevents people from learning the truth, and specifically with respect to problems like Israel and Palestine, where the media is so hopelessly prejudiced in favor of Israel for reasons that really need to be explored.
It's also the case that, we're thinking about Afghanistan and how could that 20-year war led by the United States, how could that have been avoided? Because it clearly was a disaster for the people of Afghanistan, as well as the many families who lost American soldiers in that war. And there was a time after the Taliban took over and when 9/11 had happened, the Taliban indicated that they were willing to negotiate with the Bush administration. The Bush administration said, no way, nope, we're going to make war here. Bush was going to become a war president that suited his domestic political needs, which were serious at that point. So I think, the American people have to come to understand that war is not the answer. And negotiations, even in terrible situations like the one in 2001, have to be pursued so that other mechanisms for accountability are created and supported by the U.S. government, rather than the instinct to strike out militarily all the time.
Yeah. And that just is going to require a change of heart from the people of the United States, and a change of mind too, like actually being informed about these issues and wanting to do something about it.
And just a little footnote to that. Marion Wright Edelman, who is part of our church, she tells a story about 1968 during the riots in Washington. She and many other people went down to the streets, 14th Street in this case, and tried to persuade the young men who were throwing rocks on the windows and all. And she had this 14-year-old boy had a big rock in his hand. He's about to throw it. She grabbed his hand and says, "Son, don't do that." He looked at her. He says, "Why?" And she said, "Well, think of your future." He said, "Ma'am, I ain't got no future." Well, if you ain't got no future, that's what you do. And that's what you need to redress these grievances and find out what they really are. And if it costs us some money or it costs us some penance or acknowledgement of our ways of error, going back to what we did to the Native Americans, then so be it. We have to educate our people and tell them, hey, this shining hill on the shining city, whatever it is, ain't so shiny. It's got really, really big dents in it.
Yeah. Well, that segues perfectly into the final question I want to ask you guys before we wrap up today. So how do we go about, and we've alluded to it in kind of bits and pieces on the show here today, but how do we go about convincing Christians in particular that this is an extremely important issue that we need to be concerned about? And then beyond that, what role should the church play in calling out those that are clearly abusing power?
I tell people all the time, and Ray said it not quite the same way a little bit earlier, that Jesus was not crucified for praying too much. He was indeed crucified for speaking truth to power. And the people that he ran into on a regular basis were the occupiers of his homeland, in those days, Rome, and his own ruling government in his own local environment. Those were the people who took Jesus to task most often. They were trying, they think, to keep the peace. They had this huge thing on their shoulders, Rome, and then they had all these poor people around them, and they were just trying to keep the peace. And I think that's where a lot of Christians are caught right now. There's this huge monolith called the American government. None of us believe we can actually go up against it because it's so big and it's so, many say, so corrupt. What chance do we have? So we're just trying to keep the peace. And at the end of the day, to answer your question, if the church is not willing, this is church with a big C, the leaders of the church are not willing to speak out and call for the truth, then the people who sit in the pews every week have no reason to seek the truth. So that's what it comes down to. It really does come down to telling the truth, and not to oversimplify it, but the Bible has a whole lot more to say about money than about sex, and the church spends a lot of time talking about sex. But what we really need to be doing is taking a look at where the money goes So why did people run planes into the World Trade Center? I don't know, but I think the extremism that Ray talks about has to do with the inequality of economics in this world. So if my children are hungry and sick, and I know that other people in this world have more food and more medicine than they know what to do with, I'm probably going to grow to hate those people over time. But if you fed my children and you supplied them with medicine, I might not be as happy as you are in the first world or in a developed nation, but I wouldn't be as angry as I am right now when I'm living in a hovel and my kids are dying. So those are the kind of things that the Bible talks about. And those are the kind of things that we need to take a look at and not always be worried about the bottom line or about who's really got the power. That might just be a little bit of a sermon.
No, that was beautiful. Christina, Ray, you guys want to add anything to that?
I had in mind something to add, and it's simply this. I'm a Catholic. I don't agree with the Pope on a lot of things, but I do agree with what the American Catholic bishops said under another Pope called John the 23rd. They did a very gutsy encyclical, that word again, but a really profound statement on U.S. economy. This was 1975. And what they said was, Jesus of Nazareth, the Hebrew folks before him had this thing about justice. The pre-Aramaic word for justice, tikka, denotes showing preference to the poor. A far cry from our lady holding the scales, blindfolded, right? Biased and prejudiced to the core in favor of the dispossessed, the widow, the orphan, the refugee. And so these bishops said, look, this preferential option for the poor, we're going to spell it out for you. And it means this. It means that no one is entitled to keep more of what he or she doesn't really need when others are deprived of the bare necessities of life. That's what it means. Whoa! Communism, socialism. The bishops took it on the chin for this. But that's the last time they spoke out prophetically, and they were very much in the tradition of Jesus of Nazareth and of the Hebrew prophets before him. And so I still harbor some hope that the institutional church will kind of say, well, yeah, this is the real Jesus. He died. Did he die? Did his father tell him, well, sorry, you got to die because, Adam and Eve really screwed up? I don't. I used to believe that when I was little, but I don't believe it anymore. I think he died because he pressed this measure of justice against the authorities at the time, as Jennifer had said, against the deep state and the cooperating people who like to share power, who are pretty wealthy, get along just fine, by the way, while the majority of the population, like the majority of our populations, getting to be a majority now, have trouble meeting the next meeting the next bill that comes from the hospital.
So you're saying basically, I mean, to sum all this up, if the church actually does church things, we have a shot.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said, if the church actually does church things, we have a shot.
We have a shot? Well, church things, I don't see anything in the New Testament where Jesus said, build the church.
Oh, yeah.
So you're talking church things in the wider sense.
Yeah.
And I know that, yeah. But we need to do that, and we need inspiring leadership to do that. We're not going to get that from the politicians. We'll get them from the real prophets, like the current head of the North Carolina Council of Churches. Forget her name now.
Well, guys, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm going to put links to all of your websites and things like that. But before we leave, I just want to give each of you guys an opportunity to tell my audience where they can find your stuff and learn more about all of these issues. So, Jennifer, since you wrote the piece, I'll go ahead and start with you. Where can people find out more about the work that you do with the North Carolina Council of Churches?
I think the website's the best place to go, ncchurches.org. We post most everything that we're involved in and everything that gets written about the work we do.
Beautiful. And Christina, if people want to find out more about your organization, it's in North Carolina Stop Torture Now. I wanted to make sure I say that right. Where can they learn more about the work that you do?
They can go to our website, which is ncstn.org, and they can read the torture flights report from the Blue Ribbon panel at nctorturereport.org.
Perfect. And Ray, I know you've been kind of all over the place. Do you have like a main? Where can people read your work at?
Well, my website is real simple. It's raymcgovern.com. People will notice that in my byline, I cite that I am part of the Ecumenical Church of the Savior and supported by the church to do this work. And just a word about that. The pastor of this church, Gordon Cosby, enjoined me to always make sure that I associated myself with the Church of the Savior. And when I said, "What's in that for you, Gordon?" he said, "I want it to be so that church sees that what church should be doing. And also, when they come for you, Ray, I want them to have to come for all of us." I said, "Sign me up. That's the kind of community you can build on the principle of justice, biblical justice, not American justice."
That's perfect. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm going to put links to all of your websites and all of that in the show notes so my listeners can read up on this. Again, thank you guys so much. Incredibly informative. You guys are doing some heroic work out there. Thanks again.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.